Thank you, Maria. Before I begin, I want to give a shout out to Margaret Wong back here, Associate Director, who has been really critical in keeping all this together here. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me back. I'm bookending the optimism of James Glatzman here. I'm a little surprised you did invite me back because what I'm about to say about the budget is not exactly an uplifting message. This has been a particularly difficult presentation for me to prepare for today. First, I do not have the crutch of a Congressional Budget Office forecast to back me up. That would be normally available at this time of the year, but it's not available. But more importantly, as a Republican, all cards on the table, working for an organization called the Bipartisan Policy Center. It is in a town where bipartisanship is a rare commodity, but also because for years, Republicans have claimed the mantle of fiscal responsibility. I feel a little abandoned. In 2013, Speaker Ryan said the country's debt would weigh down our country like an anchor. And in December of 2016, a little bit before this conference last year, when Republicans already controlled the House and Senate and about to claim the White House, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said, quote, "The level of national debt is dangerous and unacceptable." Well, the deficit will rise to nearly 6% of GDP, $1 trillion under Republican control, the largest outside of times of economic crisis since the Second World War. As the scarecrow observed to Dorothy, and maybe a commentary on some of our elected officials today, and maybe even this presentation, how can you talk if you haven't got a brain? I don't know, but some people without brains do an awful lot of talking. Well, I will return to Oz in closing. As it relates to the four topics I want to touch upon quickly here. The federal budget, obviously, a brief focus on health policies and prices and utilization, the estimating challenges of healthcare policy, and final, and I know I'm trespassing on other presentations in the next panel, 2018 political outlook and its impact, I think, on healthcare. On the first topic, the federal budget outlook. The budget outlook, of course, is driven in large part by the underlying economic assumptions, and the economic assumptions are driven by one's assessment of budget policies, about both that be spending or revenues. As I said, unfortunately, we do not have a current congressional forecast. That will be coming the next few weeks. In the meantime, we can see the underlying assumptions in this chart as it relates to the president's budget submission just last week, along with the most current blue chip consensus forecast. I'm sorry, I don't have Jim's. And compare them to CBO's forecast, June forecast that was done prior to the tax bill and the spending budget agreement a few weeks ago. And I want to highlight very quickly a couple of variables on that chart up there. The first is the administration's 3% real growth. I think Jim would support that for the current year, and 3.2% for next year. I should note also, however, that the administration's own estimates are, Jim, that those are 3% each year for the next 10 years going forward. Now, it's possible, but when you combine that growth with inflation up there, less than the blue chip, this is the administration's inflation, less than the blue chip, even lower than what they were predicting last year for consumer prices, and a 10-year T-bill rate lower than they are even today, one has to be somewhat skeptical of the optimism in the administration's forecast. I tested that skepticism out, and the slide presents various measurements of bias in two-year forecasts. And while CBO slightly underestimated real GDP growth over its years of projections, all administrations overestimated, and I truly doubt the current administration will disappoint when the final figures are compiled. Finally, and Jim talked about this, the long-suffering debates concerning the tax bill's deliberation and its impact upon economic growth. The goal of the administration, according to the administration, was to increase GDP growth 0.4% annually from that tax bill. Even the more conservative estimators there could not exceed 0.3%, but the final arbitrator that we have to deal with in Congress, the Joint Tax Committee, final official estimate at the end, the far right, less than 0.1%. The administration's current budget forecast obviously assume that the target has been met, and in fact exceeded. I guess time will tell, but I would note, even with this growth assumed, the administration's own budget submission last week does not reduce the deficit nor come anywhere near balance, as was the campaign promise. Now, as you can see from this particular chart, if one were to simply take the estimated $1.5 trillion impact of the tax cut bill and spread it out over the forecast horizon, the federal deficit continues its already path downward very much more quickly. Now, I admit, I don't like paying taxes any more than anyone else. And clearly there was a need to reform our tax code. I particularly think there was a need on the corporate side in the competitive global market that we're in. But there probably could have been a better way to reform the code without adding to the growing debt burden on future taxpayers. Indeed, back to Senator McConnell's statement in December of 2016, he said his preference was a tax reform that is, quote, revenue neutral. Projections of a tax reform in the recent putting all this together, combining the 1.5 tax cut with the recently enacted budget agreement, adds another at least $500 billion to the deficit over the next 2 years. It's maybe not hard to understand why I am somewhat despondent over the federal budget outlook. We are looking at $1 trillion in deficits, annual deficits, and growing up to 1.5 to $2 trillion in the out years, 107% or so of GDP. Now, I will admit and assume the next panel will address that there are a number of provisions affecting health care in the recently enacted budget agreement that will benefit many peoples, funding for CHIP through 2027, community health centers, Medicare extenders, the Chronic Care Act, permanently extending the Medicare Advantage Special Needs Program and expanding telehealth and services under Medicare Advantage and certain ACOs, and the disaster funding for the hurricanes and, of course, for the recent wildfires here, even in California. But unlike the tax bill, the bulk of those increased expenditures, excluding disasters, were offset with savings, particularly from sunsetting exclusion of biosimilars from Medicare Part D coverage. So this is good, but it does not distract from the fact that on net, federal debt will continue to grow going forward. And it continues to be true that federal spending for health, Social Security, national security, and interest on the public debt will continue to consume over 3/4 of all federal spending. Our federal government is a very large insurance company with a very large and growing security force. If decreasing debt matters, and maybe it doesn't, maybe I've wasted my career, but if it does, and if revenues are not to be increased, then it should be obvious that Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid will remain a focal point for controlling spending going forward. And I note that by 2027, we will be spending as much on national security as we will be simply paying the interest on our accumulated debt. With the short-term interest rates increasing, and I understand that some would look at this as a positive, Jim, and before the Federal Reserve's, which I think will expect it to increase rates next month and maybe two or three more times this year, as monetary policy returns to more normal conditions, the fastest growing component of the federal budget will simply be paying the interest on the public debt. I say some see the T-bill increase as a positive. I guess half glass, half empty. I see it adding $1.3 trillion for every 1 percentage point increase in those T-bill rates. Finally, before I turn to healthcare forecasting, this is a very messy chart, and I apologize. Our federal government right now is operating what is known as a continuing funding resolution, the fourth such funding resolution this fiscal year. And we are halfway through our current fiscal year. That bipartisan budget agreement reached 2 weeks ago also continues to fund government at last year's levels until March 23rd. Given time for Congress, this gives time for Congress to fill in the details of an omnibus appropriation bill for the remainder of 2018 at the negotiated higher level caps for non-defense and defense spending. As this messy chart presents, the agreements negotiated the new caps now law in comparison to the president's budget submitted just last week, almost before the ink was dry on that particular law, the president's budget does not fund at the levels that were agreed to, about $28 billion below what was agreed to 2 weeks ago for 18 and $57 billion below for 19. March Madness could still be in the cards in a few weeks as we approach March 23rd, should the president insist on his lower non-defense spending request for the current year. And before October, Congress will also have to negotiate account spending details for 2019. We could once again be looking at another standoff between Congress and the president just before the midterm elections. Turning to health policy and prices and utilization. Last week, the National Health Statistics Group issued its annual National Health Expenditure Report. They estimate health spending will grow at an average annual rate of 5.5% over the period from 2017 to the next 10 years and reach 5.7 trillion, or about 20% of GDP. The key takeaway I'd like to put on this chart from their projection is simply that post the Great Recessionary period from 2008 and the one-time effects of the ACA expansions, we are falling back into a period where personal health care price inflation will be the single largest factor explaining health care spending as it was in 1990 and 2013 period. Not utilization nor demographics. It's prices, and I guess it's John's point too, it's prices that are accelerating health care spending growth, and it appears to be prices are in the driver's seat for the foreseeable future. Prices driven in part, I think, by technology, improving quality, but also at higher cost. This conclusion is buttressed by Neil Brinsgood's work at the Health Care Cost Institute. His recent published work looking at claims data for individuals with employer-sponsored insurance found that between 2012 and 2016, total health spending increased 15%, more than 3 times the rate of CPI. But in the course, factors that relate to that, healthcare services were 1.6 times CPIU for professional services versus 5 times CPIU for prescription drugs. Further, his work concludes that healthcare spending did not increase because of utilization for ESI-covered individuals, but because of prices. Only in the case of prescription drugs was there any slightly noticeable increase in utilization. Further, on per capita spending for Medicare program, parts A, B, C, and D, the current trend line is up, averaging 4.3%. And finally, looking at the total federal expenditures over the next decade, combining all the elements, economy, prices, utilization, demographics, technology, current projections indicate that all federal health care expenditures will grow 6.4%, 2 percentage points faster than the economy. So let me quickly, and I may truncate this, and in fact, I'll blame it on the next moderator, the next panel, Murray Ross, for this diversion. He suggested this subject matter, and that has to do with the forecasting. This is a forecast conference. Forecasting, as we all know, is difficult, but I would argue even more difficult for the healthcare sector. I am not here to be an apologist for the Congressional Budget Office. Though full disclosure, as Maria said, I was an original employee of that. But this past year, CBO has come under a lot of criticism for its healthcare work products, particularly from the members of Congress themselves. I'm going to skip through this because she's giving me the hook here a little bit. Well, there's something more I want to get to. But I just want to point out that CBO's projections have, yes, they've been overestimated. But look at this. This is a hard chart to read, I understand. But if you look from between 1993 and 2016, CBO's projections underestimated actual spending $1.3 trillion, or 2.2% over that entire period. But looked at individually, they were spot on with Social Security, which makes up about 22% of all spending over that period. Medicare and Medicaid, that made up nearly 20% of all that. They accounted for 14% of the share of the mean error and 24% of the share of the mean error in the 6th year. But the real variation in estimates was net interest. Nearly 70% of the share of the mean error was devoted to net interest. Let me skip through this because I do want to get to what is probably a little bit more interesting. And that is the political setting that I think personally is going to truly drive what happens this year in the setting. I know I'm trespassing, and I apologize to the next panel, but I think more than anything else, the political environment will determine the course of the healthcare policy this year. Not current budget forecasts, nor the President or Senator Cassidy or Graham's revised repeal and replace, which is to say, while there may be some discussion of restoring what we call the CSR payments for 2019 plan years, as Senator Alexander and Murray have sought, or establishing a reinsurance pool to stabilize the individual market, as Senator Collins has asked for, which quite frankly, I don't believe either are going to take place this year, very little legislation will be enacted that deals with health care in the remaining days of this session of Congress. But this is not to say that regulatory, administrative, and particularly states will not have a big influence on policy. They will, particularly as it relates to the administration's most recent regulatory proposals as it relates to what I call mini-meds, or the Medicaid program, where non-expansion states will probably consider expansion if they can get their work requirements put through. In the state that I live in, Virginia is an example going on right now or going forward. First, despite everything we've gone through this last year, if anything, the favorability of the ACA increased. It did not decrease. It reminds me that I'm old enough to remember Jody Mitchell, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone. They paved over paradise and put up a parking lot. A reminder that 1/3 of the U.S. Senate faces the electorate this fall. And unlike 2016, it is almost the exact opposite, with more Democrats 24 up than Republicans. This should benefit Republicans to retain control going into 2019, but not necessary, because the margins are extremely small. In the Senate, 51-49, and similarly, Republicans control the House 45 seats, and as of today, 32 Republicans versus 16 Democrats in the House have announced their retirement. Watch carefully. In a few weeks, a special election in Pennsylvania to replace the vacancy formerly held by a Republican, maybe a canary in the coal mine, but also the redrawing of lines in Pennsylvania last week will have a major impact on Democrats and gives favorable treatment to Democratic pickups this fall. Back to the Senate. While the math would generally benefit Republicans, Democrats need to pick up only two seats to take control. And I'm leaning on Charlie Cook's most recent analysis. There are 4 Democratic seats that are toss-up: my home state of Indiana, Missouri, West Virginia, and Minnesota, Al Franken's old seat. There are 3 Republican seats that fall into this toss-up category: Arizona, Nevada, and Tennessee. And Tennessee, maybe not, depending upon whether Mr. Corker decides to come back to the race. The odds still are Democrats, if they can hold on those 4 toss-up seats and win just 2 of those others, they would be back in control. The odds still remain with Republican control. Regardless of whoever controls, it will be by, again, a very small margin. And again, if anything to get done, no surprise coming from somebody that works for the bipartisan party, it will have to require bipartisanship and compromise to move legislation. Now, I'm not a House guy, and I'll leave that to Wendell on the next panel, but I would only observe one factoid that really shocks me, that every midterm election in the House since the Civil War, when the president's approval rating has been below 50%, the party out of control picks up an average of 40 seats. Democrats need to pick up only 24 seats. Again, whoever controls it will be with the very smallest of margins. And finally, where I think the real electoral outcome of control will affect health care in this year or the year to come. As Marisha said, 26 of the 33 Republican governor seats are up, while 11 of 17, the Democratic seats are up. One of those have already moved into the Republican control. That's in terms of New Mexico, and of course you have your own election here in California that's solid on the Democratic. This could be a pickup year for Democrat governors. Finally, probably even more importantly, is that 87 of the 99 state legislature chambers are holding elections this fall. Obviously, Republicans are in position of dominance in state legislatures, and most analysts do not see any change in major party control there. But with more health care waivers being issued by the Trump administration, Republican control of state legislature will dominate health care policy going forward. This is where I think health care policy will be played out, not by possible legislation coming out of Washington, particularly this year. Interesting, by the way, term limits will play a role in these state elections, where Republicans have about twice as many term-limited legislators as do Democrats. And many of these term-limited Republicans came in during the Tea Party class of 2010, the wave 8 years ago. Examples, 1/3 of the Missouri's representatives are prevented from running this year. Why is this important? Because many of these legislators, particularly state senators, will be in office when the 2020 census redistricting takes place. In closing, let me just move on here and close out with, I started with The Wizard of Oz. Let me end with it. In 2013, Republican Kansas Governor Sam Brownback led his GOP-dominated legislature to significantly reduce the state's business taxes and set a path to bring income tax to zero. The governor hailed the tax cut as real live experiment in conservative governance that would lead to an explosion of economic growth for the Sunflower State. The results were anything but sunny. Revenues declined 10% in a short 3-year period, and with a constitutional state balanced budget requirement, Medicaid was privatized, state services were drastically reduced. The same Republican-controlled state legislature reversed course last year and raised $1.2 billion in individual state income taxes and overturned the governor's veto. There may be some lessons here for the federal government as it relates to fiscal policy. I believe maybe Jim will disagree, I think we're in uncharted economic territory today. In Oz, Dorothy exclaimed, "Toto, I'm feeling we're not in Kansas anymore." We may not be in Kansas in 2018, but we certainly are on an uncertain yellow, I think rapidly turning red brick road. Thank you.